We are in the midst of the 75th anniversary of World War II. In fact, it wasn't that long ago when we were remembering the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. Now, many people believe that the D-Day invasion was really the beginning of the end for Hitler and Nazi Germany. But I'm going to talk with one person right now who believes the beginning of the end really was in 1941. He has a new book out called 1941, The Year Hitler Lost the War. And I'm going to bring on that author right now, this historian, Andrew Nagorski. And Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike.
So before we get into the details of the book and the details of the history, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about yourself, your background and everything.
Sure. Most of my career, I was a journalist, worked for Newsweek magazine as a foreign correspondent and an editor. I was abroad for about 20 years, spent most of that time in Europe, in places like Moscow, Warsaw, Berlin, Bonn, Rome. So it meant that I was constantly circling around these issues related to the war. It never felt that distance. The stories kept coming back. My own personal family background, by the way, my parents grew up in Poland. They escaped from Poland. My father was in the Polish army.
Oh, wow.
In 1939 when the Germans invaded. Then instead of surrendering, he managed to escape, eventually get to France, be evacuated by the British to Britain with a Polish paratrooper unit based in Scotland, and then they stayed in Scotland in the UK for a couple of years after the war, and then they came to the States. So growing up, I heard a lot of stories about the war, and I must have absorbed a little bit more than I realized at the time, because it became almost an obsession to keep going back to this period and trying to figure out what happened. And when I was in Europe and was able to interview still a lot of people who were direct participants, or at least who were sometimes the children of some of the more senior military and political leaders, I did that as much as possible.
I think it's a good obsession to have. I mean, I love history as well. So you know a lot about World War II. You've written about World War II before. But in this book, you decided to focus on the year 1941. Why did you decide on that subject?
Well, as mentioned, as you mentioned, I've done other books related to World War II. This is, in fact, my seventh book. And of those books, I think 4 or 5 of them have had to do with the rise of the Nazi movement, the war, the aftermath. And I've always been fascinated by turning points in history. As a correspondent, I was lucky enough to, for instance, witness the epic events that led to the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and knew many of the players there, and realized that there was nothing inevitable about how that all played out. It was a lot of individual decisions, actions that came into play there. And similarly, as I've been circling around these issues of the war and leadership, it struck me that 1941 encapsulated everything that had happened in that war. And if you look at the beginning of 1941 and the end of 1941, you do see that it is the beginning of the end, because in the beginning of 1941, Hitler, Germany is riding incredibly high. They have conquered most of Central and Western Europe, and they've seemingly done it without much effort. Only Britain is holding out. The Soviet Union is on the sidelines. In fact, Hitler and Stalin had made their pact, which meant that Stalin was supplying Hitler with all sorts of things he needed for his war effort. The U.S., remember, was still out of the war. It was on the sidelines, although Roosevelt was very sympathetic to Britain and was trying to help Britain, but it was not still directly involved in the war. And yet, by the end of that year, everything has changed, and that's really the subject of my book, and how by the end of the year, what looked like a winning hand for Hitler was already clearly a losing hand.
Yeah, and you made mention earlier that you're really interested in turning points in history because a lot of turning points in history, they're not inevitable, but they're based on individual decisions. And I noticed throughout your book, you definitely focus on individual decisions, especially from Hitler, who you said made some really bad decisions within 1941 that pretty much would lead to his demise.
Yes. What's interesting is that I'd say until 1941, everybody had underestimated Hitler when he was coming to power, when he first made his moves against Czechoslovakia, Austria, then attacking Poland, and then turning to the West and Denmark, Norway, the Benelux countries, France. Everyone thought Hitler could not do all these things. Even some of his own generals and his planners were telling him, "Look, you're getting overextended. This is dangerous. You can't take on all the other powers, which are especially Britain and France, which are saying they'll stand, for instance, with Poland." And yet, he accomplishes everything he sets out to do, and even the skeptics begin to think, well, this man can do no wrong. He knows something we don't know. And he does all that, but in 1941, he underestimates everybody else. And he overestimates himself, he overestimates his own army's capabilities, his Air Force's capability. You had the Battle of Britain, which had taken place in 1941, which was the air battle with the Royal Air Force between the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and the Royal Air Force. They failed to knock out the Royal Air Force. Then they have the Blitz in 41 going on, which is the bombing campaign of London and other cities. And the idea is to bomb the Brits into submission. The Brits fail to surrender. Hitler can't understand it. And Hitler all the way is this compulsive gambler. He's this man who wants to up the ante. If he's winning, he ups the ante. And then if he's losing, he ups the ante. So he's stalled in terms of taking Britain. And he in his mind, there's a logic here. Okay, I can't take Britain. My other big goal always from the beginning, from the time I wrote Mein Kampf, it was to take the Soviet Union, those Slavic lands to the east, which are populated by what he calls Untermenschen, which means subhumans, and of course Jews, who are considered even worse than subhumans. I'll conquer, enslave, kill people there. And he says, Britain is probably holding out because it thinks eventually the Soviet Union will get into this war and then we'll be allies, even though we're not right now. So if I knock out the Soviet Union in a quick blow, Britain will then have to give up, and the United States will realize Britain has no chance and will stay out of the war too. So he then decides to attack the Soviet Union, even though his planners are saying, "Hey, this is a big country, and they've got twice the manpower." And there is that precedent, by the way, of a man called Napoleon. You better think about that. And Hitler knew enough of his history that knew what had happened to Napoleon's army back in the early 19th century when it went into Russia and then was destroyed, particularly by the Russian winter. And yet he still insists on launching this attack on Russia, and this leads to the German army's first defeat on the outskirts of Moscow. They almost get to Moscow, but they fail. And all of these things begin to create a dynamic where things are going wrong, and then he progressively then goes on to the next big thing. When the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, he decides to declare on the war on the United States even before we declare war on him. So again, it's once again up the ante, and he thinks, oh, if we've got Japan as an ally, we'll tie up the United States in the Pacific and we'll be fine. So it's this. What I try to do in the book is to explain his thinking from his point of view, which has an internal logic, but from any objective point of view, from a more detached point of view, looks absolutely crazy.
And I'm speaking right now with Andrew Nagorski. He's a World War II historian, has a new book out, 1941, The Year Hitler Lost the War. And just there you were mentioning that you tried to explain a little bit of Hitler's thinking, and there were people that kind of question his thinking, but were afraid either to say it to him or were afraid to doubt him because he had been successful in the past. Am I right?
Yes, that's very much the case. Now, first of all, Hitler can be intimidating for his own people, whether he had been right or wrong. He brooked no opposition. But there had been attempts, as I go into it in the book, by some of his people. For instance, there was a chief economic planner for the German military who did the calculations and said, if you attack the Soviet Union, you are going to be faced with a manpower pool that's twice as big, a territory which is much larger, and then once the United States is fully backing Britain and presumably the Soviet Union, you will have economies which are much larger than the German economy. All of this means that you can't win a long-term war against all these powers put together. So how does Hitler process this information? He says, I know maybe we can't win a long-term war, but we can win a short war. So we got to do it quickly. And we'll knock, for instance, Russia out very quickly, and they won't have time to recover. And then that will have that ripple effect of making Britain surrender and the United States stay out. So he's got this whole thought process that absorbs some of the information he's given, but this is a man who is a megalomaniac who does not accept the notion that he can be wrong on the fundamentals, on his fundamental assumptions.
All right, we're speaking with Andrew Nagorski on his new book, 1941, and he was talking a little bit there about Hitler's motivations. In the next couple of segments, I want to get into the motivations of Stalin, the thinking behind Stalin, and also Churchill and Roosevelt. And Andrew, do you have a website that people can find out more about you in your books?
Yes, the website is Andrew Nagorski, written together, and it's NAGORSKI.com. So AndrewNagorski.com.
Oh, okay, 1941, the year Germany lost the war, available where all books are available, Amazon.com, and so forth. We'll continue this conversation in a moment. Was 1941 the year that Germany lost the war? That things really started to change against Germany and the Axis and in favor of the Allies? Well, I'm speaking with one historian right now, Andrew Nagorski, who makes that argument in his new book. The title, 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War. And Andrew, I appreciate you once again joining the show. And in the last segment, we were talking a little bit about Hitler's thinking. He was kind of a megalomaniac. He always wanted to up the ante. Even when advisors told him not to, he would keep pushing forward on things that probably wasn't wise. It worked for him in the past, but it started not to work for him in 1941. And one of those big decisions was to invade the Soviet Union. Now, in the book, you also talk about how Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, was actually surprised by this and was not expecting this.
Yes, I mean, these are two megalomaniacs I'm talking about. I mean, Hitler and Stalin were in close competition in terms of people who brooked no opposition, who always had their own theories, always considered themselves smarter than everybody around them, and had their own delusions. And in Stalin's case, he had also exceptional paranoia, which meant that, first of all, he had made this pact with Hitler, not believing necessarily that he can have a endless peace with Hitler. He had enough of a sense that Hitler's ambitions were aimed in the direction of his own country, but he thought they could stay together at least for a good deal longer. And in part, he wanted to believe that because his own army was weak at that point. They They had fought a war in Finland that they'd done badly in. He had purged the officer corps, which meant he'd executed a lot of his top officers because he suspected they were guilty of plotting against him. This was mostly a product of his own paranoia. And so he would not believe all the warnings that were coming that Hitler's armies were about to attack him. And he was getting these warnings from the U.S., from Britain, and from his own spies, by the way. He had lots of spies in Western Europe, in Japan, elsewhere, saying that Hitler is about to attack. And in Stalin's paranoid mind, if everybody is telling him that, it must not be true. It must be a trick. And he refuses to get his army really ready for this attack. Many of his troops don't even have adequate weapons. They're exposed. The Air Force planes are all on the runways when Hitler's armies attack, and that's why Hitler at first scores huge victories. But just like Hitler overestimated his ability to move quickly, and even sent in his troops without winter uniforms, thinks he had plenty of time to defeat Stalin's armies before the winter set in. Stalin had totally underestimated Hitler's ability to attack quickly, and Hitler is attacking with 3 million troops. How can you disguise that? And yet Stalin refused to read the signals right.
And isn't it true that it was not Hitler's original intention to hit the Soviet Union at that time, because he originally wanted to invade Britain? Isn't that right?
Well, he originally had thought in 1940 if the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had knocked out the Royal Air Force, that they might have a land invasion of Britain. It was at one point. It was actually, there were preparations. Some early preparations were made, but when the battle in the air did not succeed, that's when he began to abandon that. But he did have this idea that he would, all along, that the big German conquest would be in the east. This would be where the Germans could set up their colonies and could just treat the Slavs as slaves, and then use the farmlands of the Ukraine and other territories and as their natural resource base. So the Soviet Union was always in Hitler's sights, but he had postponed that initially, thinking that he might take care of Britain first.
I'm speaking with author Andrew Nagorski, World War II historian. His new book is 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War. And, one thing I found interesting but also disturbing in your book, you had mentioned that you're of Polish descent. And in part of the book, you give details about how the Polish people were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place when all this was going on. They definitely did not like Hitler's Germany, but they also had big problems with Stalin's Soviet Union. And it seemed like no matter who was going to win this battle, the Polish people were going to lose.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Remember when Stalin and Hitler made their pact, they basically agreed to divide up Poland. So Hitler's armies attack Poland on September 1st, 1939, which starts World War II. They attack from the west. On September 17th, the Red Army attacks from the east. So they immediately carve up Poland, the Baltic states. And one of the things that I also point out in this book is that even in these early days of the war, Stalin was already planning how he was going to hold on to the gains of the Nazi-Soviet pact and add to Soviet territory and influence in Eastern Europe. And, of course, the other big losers in all of this were the Jewish populations of all these countries, particularly Poland, Ukraine, Russia, because Hitler it's not an accident that 1941 is also the year that Hitler launched the Holocaust, as his troops march into territories that into Eastern Poland and the Soviet Union, and he uses this to act on his long-held views that Jews must be simply killed. Up till then, there had been ghettos, there had been some killings, but not the organized killings on the scale that begin to happen in 1941, at first by groups of special killing squads which go into Soviet villages and towns and simply line up people and shoot them. Later on, they begin to develop the quote-unquote more sophisticated methods of the gas chambers. This is a year where Hitler begins to lose, but also there are so many other people who are basically condemned millions are condemned to death.
Yeah, you mentioned there that so many other people were condemned to death, millions of people. We all know about the Holocaust, but one thing you detail in the book is it wasn't just Jews who were persecuted very brutally, but it was also a lot of the Soviet military that ended up surrendering, and they were left in camps as well.
Yes. I mean, one of Hitler's huge mistakes was when his armies invaded the Soviet Union. At first, some of the people there, including many soldiers in the Red Army, were ready to surrender to German forces. And some villagers and townspeople believed, well, we've been so terrorized by Stalin and his policies in the Soviet regime. It wasn't that they knew much about Hitler or the Nazi ideology or what it represented, but they thought anybody's got to be better than Stalin. Well, Hitler immediately unleashes his own reign of terror, and when they capture literally millions of hundreds of thousands and then millions of Red Army troops, they treat them so viciously and starve them, and so many die that these troops who at first had almost willingly given up in some cases because they weren't prepared, they didn't have the weapons, they were overrun, and thought they might be better off in captivity. Stalin's invocations, fight to the end, begins to work because people quickly get word that if you surrender to the Germans, you're likely to lose your life. So there's this competing war of terror. Stalin has had this war of terror against his own people, but then Hitler comes in and immediately starts a war of terror that's even worse in many ways for a lot of the people, and that helps stiffen Soviet resolve to fight back no matter what people thought of Stalin.
Andrew Nagorski, author of the new book, 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War. You can find the book at Amazon.com or wherever books are available. You can also find it on his website. What is your website one more time, Andrew?
It is AndrewNagorski.com.
All right. A very important book about the history as we are in the 75th anniversary of World War II. We are remembering the 75th anniversary of World War II. It wasn't that long ago when we were discussing the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. Now, many people believe that it was that invasion that was the beginning of the end for Hitler's Germany, but others believe, including my guest, Andrew Nagorski, historian who has a new book out titled 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War. So he's saying in his book that really the turning point was from decisions made by Hitler and others in 1941 that really turned the page against Nazi Germany. And Andrew, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Now, in the last couple segments, we were talking about the thinking of Hitler, why he decided to go after the Soviet Union, how Stalin reacted to all of this, and why he wasn't as prepared. But there are two other world leaders, of course, that are involved in all this, and that's FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the U.S., and Winston Churchill in the U.K. Now, talking about those two leaders, what happened to them in 1941? What decisions did they make that you feel like helped start the end of Nazi Germany?
I think what was crucial here, that 1941 was the year when Churchill and Roosevelt brought their two countries more closely together. And Churchill wanted, of course, and needed U.S. support, logistical support, military weapons, fuel, all sorts of supplies. Britain knew that it could not hold out without American logistical support, and ultimately there was a feeling that it may not be able to hold out without American military support. But Churchill was very much aware that Roosevelt had a difficult situation at home. In the U.S., there was a strong isolationist movement, the American First Movement, and Charles Lindbergh particularly was one of its most famous proponents. There was a feeling that the U.S. had gotten involved in World War I at the end, and it was supposed to have cleaned up the mess in Europe, but of course it didn't. It only led to more chaos and eventually the rise of Nazi Germany. And so there were a lot of people who did not want to send our boys abroad. So Roosevelt had to be careful, and Churchill knew he had to be careful in terms of how aggressively he pushed for American support. But Roosevelt and Churchill developed a very close personal relationship, even though they hadn't known each other before particularly, and they were a little distrustful of each other. Roosevelt tended to look at Churchill as this British imperialist, the lover of empire, and Churchill at times was a little impatient with Roosevelt, saying he's not really leading public opinion, he's following it. But they worked out a relationship, and a lot of correspondence went back and forth, letters, cables, and by the way, bypassing the man who had been U.S. ambassador to Britain until the end of 1940 and the very beginning of 1941, formerly Joseph Kennedy, who had been telling the Americans that Britain was not going to be able to withstand the Nazis and they should just cut a deal with Hitler, which of course meant doing it on Hitler's terms. But Churchill nurtured the relationship with Roosevelt and a lot of other Americans, including American correspondents, by the way, to reinforce the message that Britain was not going to give in, and hear the role of that individual, Winston Churchill, in saying that we're the one country that's not going to surrender, and you need to rally to our cause, because if you don't, basically Hitler's coming after you. And that becomes that story of 1941. And in the beginning, Roosevelt manages to get Lend-Lease legislation passed in the U.S. Congress, which is legislation which means we will supply Britain with what it needs to fight this war. Even if they can't finance it, we will lend all of these things like planes and equipment to Britain, and we'll worry about payments later.
And one thing you mention in the book, Winston Churchill was not a big fan of the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union was invaded in 1941, he immediately rushes to help them. Is that right?
That is right. Yes, Churchill and Roosevelt believe, but especially Churchill, that the German invasion of the Soviet Union was good news for Britain because it would divert Hitler's energies and forces to the east, and no matter what happened, that meant it took the pressure off Britain some, and that the more he could help Stalin's Soviet Union, even though he hated Stalin's communism, the better it was for Britain. He had a line which was I can't remember the exact wording, was he told one of his aides who said, well, how do you feel about helping the Soviet Union, a country you've always criticized? He said, if Hitler invaded hell, I'd have a good word for the devil in the House of Commons the next day. Yeah, you don't necessarily choose your allies. Yeah. If enemy of my enemy can be my friend at times.
Yes, and from what I understand as well, Japan, we haven't talked a lot about Japan, but Japan's kind of involved in all this, thinking if things go well for Germany and the Soviet Union, they might attack on the other side.
Yes, well, it was Hitler, the top German brass was hoping to lure Japan into the war against the Soviet Union from the east. At one point, German officials were even telling the Japanese, why don't you invade from the east and march through Siberia and then meet our troops, which are coming the other way? Now, that was a fantastical notion. How can you? There are thousands and thousands of miles to cover, and the Japanese were wary of this. They realized that the German forces may not be doing as well as they were claiming to be doing, and they were not eager to get lured into this, especially since they had fought the Russians on other occasions and knew that when their backs are against the wall, they can be very tough fighters. But there was a German spy in Tokyo who, a Soviet spy in Tokyo who was pretending to be, who was from a German-Russian marriage. So he spoke both German and Russian, and he was passing as a German correspondent who was sending information back to Moscow about Japanese plans. And he was finally able to tell the Kremlin that Japan won't attack Russia because they were issuing tropical shorts to their troops in Manchuria, which they knew were going to be redeployed somewhere. And if you're giving them tropical shorts in the late summer, they're not going east; they're going south to Southeast Asia.
And eventually, that would lead to attacking Pearl Harbor. Andrew Nagorski, his new book, 1941, the year Germany lost the war. We could have talked about this for 2 hours if we wanted to, but unfortunately, we're out of time. But if people want to get your book, they can get it at your website, right?
Yes, it's Andrew Nagorski. That's NAGORSKI.com. There's all the information, reviews, and links to the book on the website. Yes.
All right, Andrew, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much, Mike.